Marcus Thompson mopped the sterile floors of St. Mary's General Hospital, enduring the snickers and dismissive glances of doctors and nurses who saw only a janitor in worn scrubs. None of them knew that beneath his humble exterior beat the heart of a man who had once saved hundreds of lives, whose hands had performed miracles in operating rooms across the country. They mocked his gentle corrections when he overheard medical discussions, rolled their eyes when he lingered near patient rooms with genuine concern. But fate has a way of revealing truth in the most unexpected moments. When a catastrophic emergency would strike the hospital that cold December evening, Marcus would step forward and perform 3 life-saving surgeries that would forever change how everyone saw him and how he saw himself. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Marcus Thompson moved through the sterile corridors of the cardiac wing with the methodical precision of a man who understood that every surface, every corner, every gleaming tile served a sacred purpose. His worn blue uniform hung loosely on his lean frame, the fabric softened by countless washings, and his weathered hands gripped the mop handle with a gentleness that seemed almost reverent. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows that danced across the spotless floors he had been maintaining for 3 years, each day beginning before dawn and ending long after the last visitor had departed. Dr. Helena Whitmore swept past him without acknowledgement, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished linoleum, her platinum hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched the cold efficiency of her movements. She paused at the nurse's station, her voice carrying with practiced authority as she discussed a patient's cardiac catheterization procedure. Marcus continued his work, but his ears betrayed him, catching every medical term, every nuanced detail of the complex procedure she was outlining. When Dr. Whitmore mentioned the patient's elevated troponin levels, Marcus couldn't help but glance toward room 314, knowing instinctively that the elderly gentleman there would need immediate intervention for what was clearly an evolving myocardial infarction. The subtle shift in his posture, the way his cleaning slowed as his mind processed the clinical picture, did not go unnoticed. Dr. Whitmore's ice-blue eyes narrowed as she observed him, her conversation halting mid-sentence. "Is there something you need, janitor?" Her voice carried the sharp edge of someone accustomed to absolute authority, and the nurses around her stifled their snickers. Marcus straightened, his dark eyes meeting hers with a dignity that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within his soul. "No, ma'am. Just doing my job." But as he resumed his cleaning, she noticed how he lingered near room 314, how his movements became more deliberate, more protective. The nursing staff exchanged knowing glances, their whispered jokes about the janitor who thought he was a doctor rippling through the wing like a familiar, cruel melody that had played countless times before. The alarm clock in Marcus's cramped studio apartment buzzed at 4:30 in the morning. But his eyes had already been open for 20 minutes, staring at the water-stained ceiling where shadows from passing headlights created fleeting patterns of light and darkness. He rose with the quiet efficiency of a man whose routine had become ritual, brewing coffee in a chipped mug that bore the faded logo of Johns Hopkins Medical Center, a ghost from another lifetime. By 5:15, he was walking through the empty corridors of St. Mary's, his keycard granting him access to spaces where healing and heartbreak danced their eternal waltz. Each patient room received his careful attention, not merely the perfunctory swipe of a mop, but the reverent cleaning of a sacred space where lives hung in delicate balance. In room 207, Mrs. Catherine Mills stirred as he quietly sanitized her bedside table. "Marcus, dear," she whispered, her arthritis-gnarled fingers reaching toward him with trembling gratitude. "You're here early again." He paused his work, his voice gentle as morning rain. "How's the pain today, Mrs. Mills?" She smiled through her discomfort, recognizing in him something the doctors missed during their hurried rounds. Genuine compassion that asked no questions and expected no rewards. "Better when you're here, son. You have healing hands." Marcus's throat tightened, but he simply adjusted her blanket with the tenderness of a son caring for his mother. His small apartment told a different story than his humble uniform suggested. Behind the threadbare couch and second-hand furniture, medical journals from the past 5 years lay stacked in precise towers, their pages worn from countless readings. In the bedroom closet, pushed far behind his janitor's uniforms, hung a single white coat, its sleeves creased with memory. Above his desk, hidden behind a landscape painting, hung diplomas that bore the name Dr. Marcus Thompson. Degrees in cardiac surgery from institutions that commanded respect throughout the medical world. Late into the night, he studied by the light of a single lamp, keeping his skills sharp, his knowledge current, as if preparing for a future that seemed impossible yet somehow necessary. The journals spoke of procedures he had once performed with masterful precision, techniques he had pioneered, lives he had saved. But they also whispered of the one life he could not save, the mistake that had cost him everything, the reason he now cleaned the floors where he once walked as a healer. The memory struck Marcus like lightning as he polished the brass nameplate outside the cardiac surgery suite. 5 years ago, his own name had gleamed on such a plate. Dr. Marcus Thompson, Chief of Cardiac Surgery. He remembered the weight of that title, the respect in colleagues' voices when they called for his expertise, the way operating room lights had felt like spotlights illuminating his life's purpose. His hands had been steady then, confident, performing miracles that made headlines in medical journals. The flashback dissolved as Dr. Whitmore's sharp voice cut through his reverie. She stood beside the nurses' station with her usual entourage of residents and attending physicians, reviewing charts with military precision. Marcus continued his work nearby, but when he overheard her discussing Mrs. Chen in room 322, his trained ear caught something that made his blood run cold. The patient presents with typical chest pain, likely gastroesophageal reflux. Dr. Whitmore announced with unwavering confidence. We'll discharge her with antacids and follow up in 2 weeks. Marcus's mop stilled in his hands. He had observed Mrs. Chen earlier, noting her pale complexion, the subtle way she favored her left arm, the sheen of perspiration despite the cool room temperature. Every instinct screamed that this was not acid reflux, but an atypical presentation of acute coronary syndrome, particularly dangerous in elderly women whose symptoms often defied textbook descriptions. Unable to remain silent when a life hung in the balance, Marcus approached the group with respectful caution. "Excuse me, Dr. Whitmore," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't help but overhear about Mrs. Chen. Has anyone considered that her symptoms might be cardiac in nature? Sometimes in older women, the presentation can be quite different from what we typically expect." The silence that followed was deafening. "Doctor?" Whitmore's face flushed crimson as every eye in the vicinity turned toward them. "Did our janitor just attempt to diagnose a patient?" Her voice dripped with venom as the residents began to snicker. "Perhaps you should stick to cleaning toilets instead of playing doctor." The laughter erupted like a dam bursting, washing over Marcus in waves of humiliation. Nurses covered their mouths to hide their amusement. Residents exchanged knowing glances, and even orderlies paused their work to witness the spectacle. Marcus stood there, dignity intact but spirit bruised, as the woman he had once been regarded as an equal reduced him to nothing more than an over-eager custodian with delusions of medical knowledge. In the pediatric cardiac ward, 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez lay surrounded by stuffed animals and get-well cards that couldn't mask the gravity of her condition. Her parents, Maria and Carlos, maintained vigil beside her bed while she slept fitfully, her small chest rising and falling with the mechanical assistance of monitors that beeped with increasing urgency. Marcus had overheard Dr. Whitmore discussing Emma's case with the pediatric cardiologist just yesterday. A rare congenital defect called hypoplastic left heart syndrome that required immediate surgical intervention. The child's condition was deteriorating faster than anticipated, her oxygen saturation dropping despite maximum medical support. When Marcus cleaned her room each morning, he noticed how Emma's fingernails held a subtle blue tinge that spoke of inadequate circulation, how her breathing had become more labored over the past week. Her parents always thanked him for his gentle care, never knowing that behind his kind smile lay the expertise to save their daughter's life. 3 floors down in the trauma unit, Jake Morrison lay recovering from what doctors believed was a minor construction accident. The 32-year-old had fallen from scaffolding, sustaining what appeared to be superficial injuries and a few bruised ribs. But Marcus had observed the subtle signs that others missed. The way Jake's blood pressure had been gradually declining, the pallor that deepened each day, the increasing tenderness in his abdomen that suggested internal bleeding, the CT scan had somehow overlooked. During shift changes, Marcus had lingered outside Jake's room, hearing the man joke with nurses about getting back to work soon, unaware that blood was slowly pooling in his abdominal cavity like a ticking time bomb. In the preoperative wing, 73-year-old Mrs. Dorothy Patterson awaited what should have been routine gallbladder surgery, scheduled for later in the week. Her medical history revealed a complex cardiac condition that Marcus knew would require extraordinary precision during anesthesia. He had overheard the anesthesiologist discussing her case, noting her previous heart attacks and the delicate balance required to keep her stable during surgery. Mrs. Patterson reminded Marcus of his own grandmother, the way she knitted quietly in her bed, always offering him homemade cookies from the care packages her daughter brought. But Marcus had noticed the irregular rhythm in the monitors when he cleaned her room, the subtle signs of cardiac instability that could prove fatal under surgical stress. 3 lives, 3 different stories, 3 cases that Marcus understood better than anyone realized of his medical knowledge, like a hidden treasure that could mean the difference between life and death when fate would soon demand impossible choices. The photograph trembled in Marcus's weathered hands as he sat on the edge of his narrow bed, the paper corners softened by years of careful handling. In the faded image, a younger version of himself smiled confidently from behind surgical scrubs, his eyes bright with the unshakable certainty of a man who had never failed when lives hung in the balance. Dr. Marcus Thompson, the caption beneath had once read in Medical Weekly, "Pioneering cardiac surgeon saves hundreds." That man seemed like a stranger now, separated by 5 years and an ocean of regret that no amount of penance could ever bridge. The memory came flooding back with crystalline clarity. February 14, 2020. Valentine's Day. David Carruthers, 34 years old, father of twin daughters, had arrived at Metropolitan General with a massive heart attack that had destroyed nearly 60% of his cardiac muscle. The case was deemed impossible by every other surgeon. But Marcus had built his reputation on impossible cases, on pulling people back from death's doorstep when others had given up hope. He remembered David's wife Jennifer clutching his hand in the hallway, her eyes swollen with tears as she begged him to save her husband, to give their girls their father back. The surgery had begun flawlessly, Marcus's hands moving with the precision of a master craftsman as he rebuilt David's shattered heart with mechanical valves and artificial arteries. For 8 hours, he had worked magic, creating new pathways for blood to flow, replacing damaged tissue with cutting-edge technology. But in the final moments, as victory seemed assured, Marcus had made a single microscopic error in judgment. A suture placed 1 millimeter too close to a major vessel, a decision made in fatigue after hours of flawless work. The bleeding started as a trickle, then became a flood that no amount of skill could stop. David Carruthers died on the table while his wife waited in the hallway with balloons and flowers for a Valentine's reunion that would never come. The malpractice suit destroyed not only Marcus's career but his soul. The family's grief transformed into a legal weapon that stripped away his medical license, his marriage, his entire identity. Jennifer Carruthers had looked him in the eyes during the trial and spoken words that haunted his dreams. "You were supposed to be the best. You were supposed to save him." Marcus set the photograph back in its hiding place, his hands steady despite the tremor in his heart, knowing that redemption was a luxury he might never afford. The official letter from the State Medical Board arrived on a Tuesday morning, the crisp white envelope bearing the weight of a professional death sentence. Dr. Marcus Thompson's medical license is hereby revoked. The clinical language stated with bureaucratic indifference, reducing 20 years of healing to a single paragraph of legal terminology. His hands shook as he read the words that severed him from the only identity he had ever known, transforming him from a healer into a liability, from a doctor into a defendant, whose name would forever be associated with failure. The medical community, once his second family, turned away with the swift efficiency of self-preservation. Former colleagues crossing streets to avoid uncomfortable encounters, hospital administrators returning his calls with cold formality. Sarah, his wife of 15 years, packed her belongings with the methodical precision of someone excising a tumor from her life. "I can't live with the ghost of what you used to be," she said on the day she left. The house they had built together became a mausoleum of memories, every room echoing with the laughter of dinner parties, where he had once regaled fellow physicians with stories of miraculous saves and groundbreaking procedures. Within 6 months, everything was gone. The house sold to pay legal fees, the cars repossessed, the respect and admiration that had once surrounded him like armor, now replaced by whispers and pitying glances. When Marcus saw the janitorial position advertised at St. Mary's General Hospital, something deep within his shattered soul recognized it as a lifeline to the world he could no longer inhabit as a physician. The irony was not lost on him. Cleaning the floors where he had once walked as a god among mortals, maintaining the sacred spaces where other hands now performed the miracles that had once been his calling. But in the quiet hours before dawn, as he moved through the empty corridors with his mop and cleaning supplies, Marcus found an unexpected peace in serving the institution of healing. Even from the shadows, every spotless surface became a prayer, every gleaming tile a small act of worship in the cathedral of medicine. He discovered that there was holiness in this humble work, dignity in ensuring that the places where lives were saved remained pristine and ready for the next miracle, the next chance for someone else to succeed where he had failed. Dr. Helena Whitmore stood alone in her corner office on the 15th floor, the city lights twinkling below like distant stars as the clock approached midnight. The mahogany desk that commanded respect during daylight hours now felt like an island of isolation, surrounded by medical texts and research papers that could never fill the hollow space where warmth should have lived. She was brilliant. Everyone acknowledged that. Youngest department chief in the hospital's history, published researcher whose innovations had saved countless lives, a surgeon whose technical precision bordered on the supernatural. But brilliance had become both her shield and her prison, protecting her from the messy complications of human connection that had once brought such devastating pain. The photograph hidden in her desk drawer showed a different Helena, one who smiled with genuine joy as she stood beside a gap-toothed boy with unruly brown hair and mischievous green eyes. Tommy Whitmore had been 7 years old when appendicitis struck on a family camping trip in rural Montana, miles from proper medical care. The small-town doctor who attempted the emergency surgery lacked the skills for what should have been a routine procedure, his inexperienced hands causing a catastrophic perforation that led to sepsis and death within hours. Helena had been 18 then, pre-med at Harvard, already dreaming of becoming the kind of surgeon who could save anyone, who would never let another family endure what hers had suffered. Tommy's death had crystallized her mission with laser focus. Emotions were weaknesses that led to mistakes. Attachments were vulnerabilities that compromised judgment, and perfection was the only acceptable standard when lives hung in the balance. She had trained herself to see patients as medical puzzles rather than human beings, to maintain the clinical distance that prevented the paralyzing grief she had watched destroy her parents. Like Marcus 3 floors below, continuing his nightly rounds long after his shift had ended, Helena worked through the darkness, both of them seeking redemption in the sterile halls of St. Mary's. But where Marcus cleaned to stay close to the healing he could no longer provide, Helena operated with ruthless efficiency to honor the brother whose life had been lost to medical incompetence. They were two souls shaped by tragedy, moving through the same corridors but on opposite sides of an invisible divide, each carrying ghosts that whispered different lessons about the price of caring too much or too little. In a profession where every decision carried the weight of life and death, the cardiac surgery files scattered across the polished floor like fallen leaves, their contents spilling in a cascade of medical records and surgical reports that represented Dr. Whitmore's entire day of meticulous planning. She had just lost a patient on the table, a 68-year-old grandmother whose routine valve replacement had turned catastrophic when unexpected complications arose during surgery. Helena knelt among the scattered papers, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled, platinum hair escaping from its severe bun, as exhaustion and grief finally cracked her armor of professional composure. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered the documents. The clinical detachment that usually protected her from emotional attachment having failed her completely in the face of Mrs. Anderson's family waiting in the corridor with flowers that would never be delivered. Marcus appeared beside her without a word, his presence as quiet as his footsteps had been during his evening rounds. He knelt on the cold floor, his weathered hands moving with gentle efficiency as he helped collect the scattered files, never once making her feel foolish or weak for her moment of vulnerability. But as Helena watched him work, something extraordinary caught her attention. Marcus wasn't simply gathering papers randomly, but organizing them with surgical precision according to procedure codes and patient priority levels. His fingers moved across the documents with the familiarity of someone who understood their contents intimately, separating cardiac catheterizations from bypass surgeries, arranging pre-operative assessments in order of complexity. When he handed her the perfectly organized stack, their eyes met for a brief moment, and Helena saw something that puzzled her deeply. Not the vacant stare of someone performing menial labor, but the sharp, intelligent gaze of someone who understood exactly what these papers represented. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice softer than she had intended, stripped of its usual commanding authority. Marcus simply nodded, his dark eyes holding a depth of compassion that seemed to acknowledge her loss without judgment or pity. As he quietly resumed his cleaning duties, Helena remained kneeling on the floor, staring at the perfectly organized files in her hands, her analytical mind struggling to process how a hospital janitor could possess such intimate knowledge of medical procedures and documentation systems. For the first time in years, Dr. Helena Whitmore found herself genuinely curious about another human being, wondering what secrets lay beneath the humble exterior of the man who cleaned her floors with the same reverence she once reserved for saving lives. The Christmas decorations throughout St. Mary's Hospital sparkled with festive cheer, garland, and twinkling lights, transforming the sterile corridors into something warm and hopeful. Down in the staff break room, laughter echoed as doctors and nurses gathered for the annual holiday party, their voices carrying the relaxed joy of people temporarily freed from the weight of life and death decisions. When the volunteer coordinator asked for someone to cover the evening shift so the skeleton crew could join the celebration, Marcus's hand was the first to rise, his quiet voice offering to work through the night while others celebrated the season of giving. Whitmore glanced at him from across the room with that same puzzled expression she had worn since the evening. He helped her organize the scattered files, her analytical mind still processing the mystery of his medical knowledge. As the party moved into full swing 3 floors below, Marcus made his evening rounds with extra care, stopping first at room 314, where Emma Rodriguez lay sleeping fitfully, her small body dwarfed by the massive machinery that monitored her failing heart. Her parents, Maria and Carlos, dozed in uncomfortable chairs beside her bed, their hands clasped together in exhausted solidarity. Marcus quietly adjusted Emma's blanket, his touch gentle as a whisper, and checked her monitors with the practiced eye of someone who understood their significance. "Marcus," Maria stirred, offering him a tired but grateful smile. "You always come to check on our angel, even on Christmas Eve." Carlos nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "The doctors, they come and go so quickly, but you really see her. You care about her, like she's your own daughter." Marcus felt his throat tighten with unshed tears, knowing that if circumstances were different, if he still wore the white coat instead of blue scrubs, he could do so much more than simply care. In Jake Morrison's room, he found the construction worker joking with his girlfriend about being stuck in the hospital during the holidays, neither of them aware that Jake's blood pressure had dropped another point since afternoon rounds. Mrs. Patterson sat knitting in her preoperative room, her arthritic fingers working steadily on what she told Marcus would be a scarf for her grandson. "You remind me of my late husband," she said with a gentle smile. "He had your kind eyes, your gentle way of making people feel safe." Marcus moved through the night like a guardian angel in janitor's clothing, offering comfort where he could, watching over the 3 lives that hung in delicate balance, unaware that fate was preparing to test every skill he had ever learned. The hospital Christmas party reached its peak at 11:47 on Christmas Eve, the staff break room alive with laughter and holiday cheer, as doctors and nurses celebrated with wine and festive cocktails that loosened tongues and lightened spirits. Dr. Richardson from emergency medicine was regaling a group with an amusing story about a patient who came in with Christmas lights wrapped around his ankle. While several residents passed around a bottle of champagne someone had smuggled in despite hospital policies. Even Dr. Whitmore had allowed herself a single glass of wine, her usual rigid composure softened by the rare moment of camaraderie with her colleagues. The emergency call shattered the festive atmosphere like a gunshot in a cathedral. Code Red. Emergency Department. Code Red. Emergency Department. The intercom crackled with urgent authority as the automatic doors burst open to admit the first wave of casualties from a catastrophic multi-car pileup on Interstate 95. The collision had involved 6 vehicles during the holiday rush. Families traveling to Christmas gatherings now arriving at St. Mary's in ambulances with sirens wailing like morning bells. Dr. Richardson stumbled slightly as he rushed toward the emergency department, the wine making his movements less precise than the crisis demanded, while other staff members who had been celebrating tried to sober themselves quickly with black coffee and cold water. The skeleton crew that had remained on duty was immediately overwhelmed as trauma victims poured through the doors, broken bones, internal injuries, head trauma that required immediate surgical intervention. In the pediatric cardiac wing, far from the chaos erupting in emergency, Emma Rodriguez's monitors began to emit the sharp, urgent beeping that Marcus had been dreading. Her oxygen saturation plummeted as her fragile heart struggled against the congenital defect that was slowly claiming her young life. The little girl's breathing became labored, her lips taking on a deeper blue tinge as her body fought a battle it was destined to lose without immediate surgical intervention. Marcus burst into her room to find Maria and Carlos in panic, their daughter's small body convulsing as her heart rhythm became dangerously erratic. "Get a doctor!" Carlos screamed, but Marcus knew with sinking certainty that every qualified surgeon was either intoxicated from the party or desperately needed in the emergency department where adult lives hung in equal jeopardy, leaving Emma's fate balanced on the edge of a knife with no one available to save her except the janitor who had once been her only hope. The ambulance doors slammed open with metallic violence as paramedics rushed Jake Morrison through the emergency department entrance, his construction worker's frame strapped to a gurney that told a story of catastrophic internal trauma. What had seemed like minor injuries from his workplace accident 3 days earlier had been masking a slow, deadly hemorrhage that the multi-car pileup had violently accelerated. 28-year-old male, involved in vehicle collision, presenting with signs of massive internal bleeding, the lead paramedic shouted over the chaos as Jake's blood pressure reading made seasoned nurses step back in alarm. His girlfriend Sarah ran alongside the gurney, her Christmas Eve dress now stained with his blood, her voice breaking as she screamed for someone to save the man she had planned to propose to on Christmas morning. The trauma bay erupted into controlled chaos as Dr. Richardson, still fighting the effects of holiday wine, attempted to assess Jake's condition while his hands trembled with both alcohol and adrenaline. 3 floors above, Mrs. Dorothy Patterson's routine pre-surgical preparation took a devastating turn when her already compromised heart simply gave up the fight. The 73-year-old woman who had been peacefully knitting just hours before suddenly clutched her chest as cardiac monitors screamed their urgent warnings. The night nurse on duty frantically called for assistance, but the code team was split between the emergency department and other critical patients throughout the hospital. Mrs. Patterson's eyes rolled back as ventricular fibrillation sent her heart into a deadly rhythm that would claim her life within minutes without immediate intervention. Marcus stood in the corridor between these 3 disasters, his janitor's uniform feeling like a cruel costume, as medical training that had been dormant for 5 years surged through his consciousness with crystalline clarity. Emma's room echoed with the desperate cries of parents watching their daughter slip away, Jake's trauma bay filled with the organized panic of medical professionals trying to stop bleeding they couldn't even locate. And Mrs. Patterson's monitors flatlined with the finality of a heart that had simply stopped beating. The hospital's intercom crackled with desperate calls for surgical teams that were either incapacitated by holiday celebration or already overwhelmed by the night's cascade of emergencies. In this moment of institutional crisis, when the finest medical facility in the city proved insufficient to handle the convergence of tragedy, Marcus Thompson faced the impossible choice between maintaining his humble disguise and revealing the surgical skills that could save 3 lives hanging in the balance of Christmas Eve chaos. Dr. Helena Whitmore raced through the corridors of St. Mary's Hospital like a woman possessed, her mind calculating medical logistics with the precision of a battlefield commander facing impossible odds. She burst into Emma's room first, her trained eyes immediately recognizing the signs of cardiogenic shock that would claim the child's life within minutes without surgical intervention. "Get her to OR 3 immediately," she ordered the pediatric nurse. But even as the words left her lips, she knew the crushing reality. She was only one surgeon, facing 3 critical emergencies that each demanded her complete attention. The second-year residents who remained on duty looked at her with the wide-eyed terror of students suddenly thrust into situations far beyond their limited experience. Dr. Miller, barely 6 months out of medical school, stammered through his assessment of Jake's internal bleeding while his hands shook with the knowledge that one wrong move could kill a man. Dr. Foster, assigned to Mrs. Patterson's cardiac arrest, fumbled with the defibrillator paddles like someone handling live grenades, her textbook knowledge crumbling under the weight of real-world crisis. Helena's mind raced through the impossible mathematics of triage, RUC. She could perform Emma's cardiac surgery, but Jake would bleed to death in the trauma bay. And Mrs. Patterson's heart would never restart under the inexperienced hands of a resident who had never performed emergency cardiac resuscitation outside of a simulation lab. In the security office, grainy black and white monitors captured what trained medical eyes would later recognize as extraordinary. Marcus Thompson moved through the hospital corridors with purpose that transcended his janitor's role, his body language shifting from humble servitude to confident medical authority as crisis unfolded around him. The cameras showed him pausing outside each room, his weathered hands gripping the door frames, as internal conflict played across his features like a silent film of professional agony. His posture straightened when he observed Emma's deteriorating condition, his head tilted with the listening stance of someone processing cardiac rhythms and respiratory patterns with expert understanding. Outside Jake's trauma bay, the security footage captured Marcus stepping forward instinctively when he heard the vital signs alarms, his body moving with the muscle memory of someone who had spent decades responding to medical emergencies, only to catch himself and step back into the shadows of his assumed identity. The cameras recorded every moment of his struggle between self-preservation and the sacred oath that still burned in his heart, even as 3 lives hung in the balance of his impossible choice. The moment of decision arrived like lightning striking Marcus's soul as Emma Rodriguez's monitors screamed their final warnings, her small body convulsing as her heart fought its losing battle against congenital defect and time. Her parents clutched each other in helpless terror while the 8-year-old girl they had brought into this world slipped away before their eyes, her lips turning the deep blue of oxygen starvation that would soon claim her life. Marcus stood in the doorway, his janitor's uniform suddenly feeling like chains that bound him to a role that meant nothing when weighed against the sacred duty that had once defined his existence. The mathematical certainty struck him with brutal clarity: Emma without immediate surgical intervention. Emma would die within minutes, and no qualified surgeon was available to save her. He stepped into the room with movements that shed 5 years of humble servitude like a snake shedding its skin, his weathered hands moving with the fluid precision of muscle memory that had never truly forgotten its purpose. "I need you to trust me," he told Maria and Carlos, his voice carrying an authority that made them step back instinctively as he approached their daughter's bedside. Marcus's hands found Emma's pulse points with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this examination thousands of times, his fingers reading the story of her failing circulation with expert understanding. He began emergency stabilization procedures that only a cardiac surgeon would know, adjusting her positioning to optimize blood flow, manipulating her airway with techniques learned in operating rooms across the country. Nurse Jennifer Walsh entered the room expecting to find grieving parents and discovered instead a hospital janitor performing advanced cardiac life support with the skill of a master physician. "Security!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the corridors as she reached for the emergency button. "Security to pediatric cardiac, immediately!" Marcus never paused in his work, his hands continuing their precise movements as he performed an emergency pericardiocentesis using improvised instruments, draining fluid from around Emma's heart with movements so precise they seemed choreographed. The little girl's color began to improve as Marcus worked his quiet miracle, her breathing steadying as her heart found its rhythm again under the guidance of hands that had once been among the finest in the profession. "Call Dr. Whitmore," Marcus said quietly, never lifting his eyes from his patient. "Tell her Emma Rodriguez is stable, but she'll need immediate surgery if she's going to see Christmas morning." Security officers thundered down the corridor toward Emma's room, their heavy footsteps echoing like gunshots as Nurse Walsh's frantic calls brought the hospital's protective protocols into motion. They burst through the doorway expecting to find a delusional janitor endangering a child, but instead discovered a scene that defied every assumption about the humble man who had cleaned their floors for 3 years. Dr. Helena Whitmore arrived at the same moment, her breath catching in her throat as she witnessed Marcus performing advanced cardiac stabilization with the fluid precision of a master surgeon, his weathered hands moving with an expertise that spoke of decades spent saving lives. Emma's monitors showed steady improvement under his care, her color returning to healthy pink as her heart found its natural rhythm again under the guidance of someone who clearly understood the intricate mechanics of pediatric cardiac emergency. "Stand down, doctor," Whitmore commanded the security officers, her voice cutting through the chaos with absolute authority as her analytical mind processed the impossible scene before her. The guards hesitated, confused by the order to allow a janitor to continue what appeared to be unauthorized medical treatment. But the steel in her voice brooked no argument. Marcus looked up at her with eyes that held both desperate hope and profound resignation. Knowing that his secret was now exposed, and his fate rested in the hands of a woman who had spent 3 years treating him as invisible. "Dr. Whitmore," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of confession, "I know this looks impossible, but I can save all 3 of them if you'll assist me. Emma needs immediate surgery. Jake Morrison is bleeding internally from a splenic rupture that the trauma team missed, and Mrs. Patterson requires emergency cardiac bypass to restart her heart." The words hung in the sterile air like a lifeline thrown across an ocean of doubt and protocol. Helena stared at this man who had cleaned her floors while possessing knowledge that rivaled her own, her mind racing through the implications of what he was proposing. "Who are you?" she whispered, though part of her already suspected the answer. Marcus straightened, shedding the last vestiges of his humble disguise as he spoke the words that would change everything. 5 years ago, I was Dr. Marcus Thompson, Chief of Cardiac Surgery at Metropolitan General. Tonight, I'm asking you to let me be that man again, because these 3 people are going to die without us." The surgical scrub room became a confessional as Marcus and Dr. Whitmore stood side by side at the steel sinks, their hands moving through the ritual of preparation that had once been as natural to him as breathing. Steam rose from the hot water as Marcus spoke the words that had been trapped in his throat for 5 years, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. "I graduated from Johns Hopkins, completed my residency at Mass General, and spent 15 years building a reputation as one of the finest cardiac surgeons on the East Coast," he said, his weathered hands scrubbing with the methodical precision of muscle memory. "I published over 200 papers, pioneered 3 surgical techniques that are still used today, and saved more lives than I ever bothered to count." "Doctor," Whitmore's hands stilled in the soapy water as recognition dawned across her features like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "Marcus Thompson," she whispered, her voice filled with awe and disbelief. "The Thompson technique for complex valve replacement, the Marcus protocol for pediatric cardiac emergency. Your work on artificial heart integration changed everything." She turned to face him fully, her ice-blue eyes searching his face for the legend she had studied in medical school. You disappeared 5 years ago after the Carruthers case. Everyone wondered what happened to you." Marcus nodded, his throat tight with the weight of confession. "I made one mistake, and it cost a good man his life. I lost everything. My license, my marriage, my identity, but I never lost my skills. And tonight, Jake Morrison is going to bleed to death unless we get to him in the next 10 minutes. They moved into the operating room where Jake lay unconscious, his vital signs painting a grim picture of internal hemorrhage that was slowly claiming his life. Marcus approached the table with the confident stride of a man returning to his true calling, his hands finding their natural position as he began the complex abdominal surgery that would locate and repair the splenic rupture that had been slowly killing the construction worker for days. Dr. Whitmore assisted with the precision of someone working alongside an equal, watching in amazement as Marcus's fingers moved through Jake's abdomen like a pianist playing a masterpiece, identifying damaged tissue and repairing it with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. Marcus requested quietly, and she placed the instrument in his hand with perfect timing, their partnership flowing like they had worked together for years rather than minutes. Under his expert guidance, Jake's bleeding stopped, his blood pressure stabilized, and color returned to his face as life was literally restored by hands that had never forgotten their sacred purpose. Mrs. Dorothy Patterson lay motionless on the cardiac unit table, her 73-year-old heart having surrendered to the strain of medical crisis, the monitors displaying the flat, unforgiving line that announced the absence of life. Word had spread through Street Mary's hospital like wildfire that the janitor was actually a legendary cardiac surgeon, and staff members gathered in the observation gallery above the cardiac suite, their faces pressed against the glass in disbelief as they watched Marcus Thompson prepare to attempt what seemed impossible. Marcus approached Mrs. Patterson's still form with the reverence of someone who understood that death was not always final, that sometimes skilled hands could coax life back from the threshold of eternity. He placed his weathered palm gently on her forehead, his voice soft as a prayer as he spoke to her unconscious form. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Marcus. I know you're tired, but your grandson still needs that scarf you're knitting, and I'm not going to let you miss Christmas morning with your family." Dr. Whitmore watched in fascination as Marcus began the emergency cardiac bypass procedure, his movements flowing with the natural grace of someone performing their life's calling. His hands seemed to dance across Mrs. Patterson's chest as he accessed her heart, identifying the blocked arteries that had caused her cardiac arrest and creating new pathways for blood to flow around the damaged tissue. The surgical technique he employed was flawless, each incision precise, each suture placed with mathematical perfection that spoke of thousands of hours spent mastering his craft. Nurses who had rolled their eyes at his medical suggestions now stood transfixed, watching him work with the skill that legends were built upon. "There," Marcus whispered as he completed the final connection, his voice filled with gentle triumph. "Come back to us, Dorothy." The monitors erupted into the rhythmic beeping of a heart restored to life, Mrs. Patterson's chest rising and falling with the steady breath of someone who had been given a second chance at Christmas morning. In the observation gallery, Dr. Richardson shook his head in amazement, his earlier intoxication replaced by sober recognition of true greatness. "That's the most beautiful surgery I've ever witnessed," he murmured to no one in particular. Marcus stepped back from the table, his blue janitor's uniform now stained with the evidence of his true calling, as Mrs. Patterson's eyes fluttered open to meet his gentle gaze with recognition and gratitude that needed no words. The dawn of Christmas morning found Street Mary's hospital transformed, not by decorations or holiday cheer, but by the profound realization that miracles could emerge from the most unexpected places. In the pediatric cardiac wing, Emma Rodriguez sat up in bed, her color healthy and vibrant as she played with the stuffed reindeer her parents had brought for Christmas, her heart beating strong and steady after Marcus's emergency intervention. 3 floors down, Jake Morrison squeezed his girlfriend's hand as he learned that the internal bleeding that would have killed him had been repaired by surgical hands that belonged to a man he had never noticed during his hospital stay. Mrs. Dorothy Patterson resumed her knitting in the cardiac recovery unit, her fingers working steadily on the scarf that would indeed be finished in time for Christmas, her heart beating with the rhythm of life restored by someone she had known only as the gentle janitor who always brightened her day. Marcus sat in the hospital administrator's office, still wearing his stained blue uniform, his weathered hands folded in his lap as he waited for the legal consequences he was certain would follow. Hospital security had confiscated his keycard, and lawyers had been called to address the liability nightmare of an unlicensed individual performing surgery, regardless of the lives he had saved. Dr. Whitmore burst into the office with her laptop open, her usual composed demeanor replaced by passionate advocacy as she presented her research to the assembled administrators. "This man published more groundbreaking cardiac research than our entire department combined," she declared. Scrolling through pages of medical journals that bore Marcus's name, the Carruthers case was a tragedy. But 5 years of investigation by the medical board concluded it was an unavoidable complication, not malpractice. His license was revoked due to political pressure, not medical incompetence. The administrator's phone rang with the first of 3 calls that would change everything. Maria Rodriguez spoke through tears of gratitude, declaring that any legal action against the man who saved her daughter would be met with fierce opposition. Jake Morrison's family echoed the sentiment with the determination of people who understood that bureaucracy meant nothing compared to life itself. Dorothy Patterson's daughter delivered the final word with the wisdom of someone who had almost lost her mother on Christmas Eve. "That man gave us back our family. If this hospital punishes him for saving lives, every newspaper in the country will hear about it." Marcus looked up at Dr. Whitmore with wonder in his dark eyes, seeing not the cold, ambitious surgeon who had mocked his medical knowledge, but a woman who understood that redemption sometimes required the courage of others to recognize what had always been true. The story of Marcus Thompson spread through St. Mary's Hospital like a healing balm, carried in whispered conversations through corridors that had witnessed his humble service for 3 years. Nurses gathered in break rooms, sharing memories of the quiet janitor who had always seemed to understand medical discussions with uncanny precision, while residents recalled how his gentle suggestions had often been more accurate than their own diagnoses. The shame was palpable among those who had mocked him, their previous laughter now transformed into profound regret that weighed heavily on their consciences. Nurse Jennifer Walsh, who had called security when she found him saving Emma's life, approached Marcus in the corridor with tears streaming down her cheeks. "I am so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of recognition. "All those times you tried to help, and we treated you like you didn't matter." Dr. Richardson found Marcus restocking supply closets and stood there speechless, remembering every condescending comment he had made about the janitor who thought he was a doctor. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said quietly, "but I'm asking for it anyway." Marcus met each apology with the same gentle dignity he had shown during his years of service, his weathered hands reaching out to comfort the very people who had wounded his spirit. Whitmore became his fiercest advocate, using her position as department chief to navigate the labyrinthine legal complexities surrounding his unlicensed practice of medicine. She spent hours on conference calls with medical board officials, hospital lawyers, and state licensing authorities, her analytical mind dissecting every regulation and precedent that might apply to Marcus's extraordinary circumstances. Good Samaritan laws protect civilians who provide emergency medical care, she argued in heated discussions with hospital administrators. Dr. Thompson's actions were performed under emergency conditions when no licensed physician was available, and 3 lives were saved as a direct result. She researched legal precedents involving physicians whose licenses had been suspended or revoked, finding cases where emergency interventions had been legally protected when performed to save lives. Her advocacy extended beyond legal arguments to something deeper, a recognition that Marcus embodied everything she had forgotten about why she became a doctor in the first place. The man who had cleaned her floors had reminded her that healing was about more than technical skill. It required the courage to act when others would not, the humility to serve regardless of recognition, and the wisdom to know that redemption was always possible for those who sought it with genuine hearts. The state medical board hearing room filled with an energy that transcended bureaucratic proceedings, transformed into a courtroom where redemption itself stood trial. Dr. Helena Whitmore approached the witness stand with the commanding presence that had made her legendary in operating rooms, but her voice carried an emotional resonance that surprised everyone who knew her reputation for clinical detachment. "Members of the board," she began, her ice-blue eyes scanning the panel of physicians who held Marcus's future in their hands. "I stand before you not just as a colleague, but as someone who witnessed firsthand what true rehabilitation looks like." She spoke of Marcus's 3 years of humble service, how he had cleaned floors with the reverence of someone maintaining sacred ground, how he had comforted patients and families without seeking recognition or reward. This man spent 5 years in penance, not hiding from medicine, but serving it in the most fundamental way possible, ensuring that healing environments remained pristine for others to perform the miracles he could no longer provide. The gallery behind her overflowed, with supporters whose lives Marcus had touched in ways both large and small. Maria and Carlos Rodriguez sat with 8-year-old Emma between them, the child's healthy glow a testament to surgical skill that had saved her life. Jake Morrison attended despite his recent surgery, his arm around the girlfriend he had proposed to on Christmas morning, their love story nearly ended by internal bleeding that only expert hands could have repaired. Dorothy Patterson occupied the front row, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on another scarf, her presence a living reminder that second chances could bloom even in the darkest hours. When Marcus finally took the stand, his weathered hands steady on the witness chair, he spoke with the quiet dignity that had sustained him through years of exile from his calling. "5 years ago, I made a mistake that cost a good man his life," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authentic remorse. "I lost everything I thought defined me, my license, my reputation, my identity as a healer, but in those darkest moments, I discovered something profound. Purpose doesn't come from titles or recognition, but from service to others." He spoke of finding meaning in humble work, of learning that healing happened not just in operating rooms, but in every act of compassion, every moment of genuine care for human dignity. "Redemption isn't about erasing our mistakes," Marcus continued, "but about transforming them into wisdom that serves others. Every floor I cleaned, every patient I comforted, every life I've touched these past 3 years has been my way of honoring the sacred trust I once betrayed." 6 months after that miraculous Christmas Eve, Dr. Marcus Thompson walked through the corridors of St. Mary's Hospital wearing surgical scrubs that felt both familiar and transformed, the fabric carrying new meaning earned through years of humble service and profound redemption. He still arrived before dawn and stayed well past sunset. But now his early mornings were spent reviewing surgical cases and his late evenings checking on patients with the gentle bedside manner that had never left him. The observation gallery above operating room 3 filled with faces that told the story of second chances and Christmas miracles. Emma Rodriguez pressed her nose against the glass, her parents beside her as they watched the man who had saved their daughter prepare for his first official surgery since his reinstatement. Jake Morrison stood with his new fiancée, the engagement ring sparkling as she squeezed his hand, both of them remembering the construction worker who had nearly died from internal bleeding that only expert hands could repair. Dorothy Patterson sat knitting in the front row, her completed scarf wrapped around her shoulders like a badge of victory over death itself. Dr. Helena Whitmore entered the operating room not as the cold, ambitious surgeon who had once mocked a janitor's medical knowledge, but as a colleague and friend who had learned that true greatness came from recognizing it in others. "Ready, Marcus?" she asked, using his first name with the warmth of someone who had discovered that professional respect could bloom into genuine friendship. Marcus nodded, his hands steady as he approached the operating table where a 17-year-old boy waited for the cardiac surgery that would give him a normal life. But these were different hands now, transformed by years of cleaning floors and comforting patients, shaped by the understanding that healing required more than technical skill. As he made the first incision with masterful precision, Marcus carried with him every lesson learned in the shadows, every moment of service that had taught him the true meaning of his calling. He had learned that redemption was possible for anyone willing to serve others without recognition, that second chances were gifts to be treasured, and that sometimes the greatest healers were those who had first learned to heal themselves through humble acts of love. In a world that often judges by appearances and dismisses the quiet dignity of those who serve, Marcus Thompson's story reminds us that extraordinary purpose can emerge from the most ordinary circumstances, and that the hands that clean our floors today might just be the hands that save our lives tomorrow.